Hi, and welcome to my YouTube channel. In this video, we're going to talk about backing up your database, an Access database. So I'm going to present a couple different approaches, the common different approaches that can be used, and we'll briefly touch upon maybe a little bit of the pros and cons of each, just so you're aware a little bit of anything you should be aware of with each one. And then we'll have a little bit more of a general discussion after we cover different options. So let's dive in. Access database backups. Now, my title, I originally said automatic, I know, but my first one, as you can see, is actually manual backups. And yes, I know that's not an automatic method, but it's still the method that far too many people still employ to this day, so we have to mention it. The pros, obviously, there's nothing to set up. You're not reliant on your IT department or IT personnel. You don't need to get special permissions and fill out paperwork and things like that. So the pro is that you are in control and you can do it immediately. Where it falls apart is, well, it requires you to do the work, so it's labor intensive. It's easy to forget. It's easy to just dive in, use a database, and forget to do a backup. And similarly, it's easy because easy to forget. It's easy for it to be done infrequently or not done at all. So you can end up where you need a backup and you don't have one because you don't have it scheduled, as you'll see with the more automatic methods. So if you don't have a backup and you're not, you don't have time to do other setups, at least perform the manual backup. That's a bare minimum. Number two is the system backup. What do I mean by system backup is most computers nowadays have backup software installed. And now I'm talking about personal computers and small businesses here. So they'll have, Western Digital backup. They'll have Acronis. They'll have there's a whole slew. McAfee even has their backup. So a lot of computers nowadays have these backup systems. So it's just a question of adding your database folder, whatever the case may be, to that routine. So just adding it as an item to be backed up. The pros here, once again, if it's on your local machine, well, then, once again, you're in control. You're in the driving seat, so you don't need to contact anyone, get permissions, wait for them to do the setup. You should be capable of doing that. Just go into your software, go select that file or folder, set up the frequency, and then it's done. The con side of this, and we're going to touch upon it several times with all of these automated systems, and we'll talk about it more in depth at the end, is that it doesn't ensure that the database isn't in use when it makes the backup. And that can lead to problems. So it's better than nothing. Don't get me wrong. Any backup is better than no backup. But this still isn't the ideal situation. The third approach is to use Windows built-in scheduled tasks. And you can set up on a frequency automatically performing a backup. And I got to be careful here. I'm saying a backup, but in reality, what it is it's on a certain frequency that you set up. It's going to, in the case that I describe, call and execute a VB script. The VB script is the one that does the backup for you. So all the Windows scheduled task does is it runs the script for you. The script does all the work. The pros, well, it depends on the business setup that you're in. For individuals, small businesses, typically you can do this setup yourself. So you just go into Windows scheduled task and create a new task. If you're in a big enterprise setup, well, then most probably you have to get IT involved for this. The cons, well, there's setup and administering it, and you've got to create a VB script here. But it does work quite well. I have a couple clients. This is the way they're set up. I have a link here that will bring you to an example of a VB script that you can use. So if ever you want to look it over or just put it in place, this is an example of one of the VB scripts that I have running. The next approach is let's get our IT department involved. Now, this obviously is for larger corporations where you really have an infrastructure for technology, right? Your IT admins. So these are situations where most of the time your computer's locked down. So most of the other options besides manual are locked down and you can't. So this is the case where you have to go to your IT department, probably put in some type of request. It's going to have to be approved. So there's a timeline here. But eventually your IT department should be able to, as part of their backup process, back up the folder files for your database. The nice thing here is it's going to be administered properly. It's going to be done in a timely manner. You don't have to do any of the setup. It's all done by IT. The downside, and this really depends on the company you're in, some IT departments are exceptional. You reach out to them and problems are taken care of immediately. But there are, and I have experienced it, companies where their IT department are less than reactive. And you can put in a request to have a file restored, and it can take days, if not even longer in some instances. So, it isn't a bad option if you've got a responsive IT department. That said, we're back at the scenario where it doesn't necessarily take into account the fact if the database is currently in use. So you can end up with issues with the backups that are made. They happen rarely, but they can happen. The VB script approach, if it's scripted properly, it can take into account the fact that a database is currently being used and then, opt out of the backup and only perform it when nobody's in it. So the Windows scheduled task, I didn't mention it, but it's one of these things. If it's set up properly, it can be reliable. Otherwise, it could face the same issue that the other approaches have. The last approach that I'm going to talk about, and this is one of my preferred approaches in general, is I have the database do its own backup. And I have it do it at the startup. And the logic here is quite simple. The first person that's going to log in the morning, before it connects to tables, so before it establishes a connection to the backend, the database is going to check, was the backup done today? If no, then let's check and see if it's currently in use. And if it isn't in use, then it's going to perform a backup. And the next person that will go in and log on, it's going to go and see, a backup was done today and just abort. So this is a great approach. Basically, the first person in the quote-unquote morning, depends how many shifts you have, but the first person to log into the system on whatever frequency you program, it automatically does it seamlessly for them. The beauty here with Access is that you're able to utilize a form and display a clean message to them, performing database backup, please be patient. And you can even, add tracking to it. You can have a form with the history of backups and they can review, have backups being performed. What backups do we have currently? Things like that. So it offers a whole world of opportunities here. And like everything in Access, it can be tweaked to suit your specific needs. So this is one approach I particularly privilege. Yes, obviously, there's the setup. You need to administer it. But once it's in place, in my experience, it works beautifully. And you don't have to get IT involved. You don't have to get permissions. You're, in control of your database. Once again, to me, that's ultimately what I'm always after. The less I have to get IT involved for anything, the better. And typically they appreciate that. So something definitely to consider. It brings us to an important question here is what needs to be backed up? Well, a properly set up database is two components, right? It's been split. So you have a front end and a back end. Well, the front end only needs to be backed up once every time a new version is released. So the front end isn't as critical in a general sense of being done frequently. It needs to be done, mind you, after a new version is released. But in general, what we're really after is we want to back up the back end, the data, what the users are changing continuously on a daily basis. The frequency depends on your usage. If you have a database that isn't used very much, then you might be able to get away with doing it on a weekly basis. In some scenarios, a daily basis isn't even enough, and it needs to be done more on an hourly basis. It all depends on how much data you're willing to lose. And that's true for any backup system, not just for backing up an Access database. The question you always have to ask yourself is, how much are you ready to lose? So typically, I have my setups, and for my clients as well, set up that every morning it's getting backed up. Like I said, the first person that logs in. But obviously each situation scenario is different, and you will have to adjust based on usage. The important thing here is that you're backing up whatever frequency, but your backend, because that is what changes. The note here in orange is what I was discussing about. You always want to ensure the database isn't currently in use. Now, why is that? Well, it doesn't happen often, but it is possible that at the moment that you make a copy, someone is actively in a record editing, making a change, and by bad luck, you copy it while that's happening. And it is rare, but you can end up with a corrupted file that you've copied or corrupted records. So that is why it's important to ensure no lock file is present. If there's no lock file, it means no one's in the system, in that database. So it is safe to back up. So if you're using VBA, VBScript, it's important in that folder, look for the lock file and only back up when there is no lock file. With the database startup method, you can even incorporate a technique to boot users out. So you could force punctual backup for some emergency reason, not just in the morning doing it before anyone logs in, but even have the capacity to boot everyone out because I need to do a backup immediately or maintenance immediately. So that's the crux of the matter. That's really what you need to know. We are backing up the front end whenever a new one's released. Back up your back end, your data, as frequently as you're willing to risk losing the information. I recommend daily typically. Backup validations. Well, what is a backup if you don't validate that it works? It's nothing. And I'm talking from firsthand experience. I always think of a company I once worked for as an IT admin, and no, I was not responsible for backups, so don't blame me. And this was a multinational engineering firm. And long story short, massive amounts of engineering work were done every day by hundreds of employees. And one day something went wrong, and one of the engineers approached my boss in reality, and asked to recover a specific drawing. Something had happened because multiple disciplines work on the same drawing at the same time. Something happened. And my boss was like, no problem, because we do nightly backups. Well, it turned out that although all the systems always showed, everything was okay, the backup was done, we were getting backup file sizes they were in terabytes back then. And long story short is when you did the recovery, the file didn't work. It was garbage. There was actually no backup that had been done in over 2 years, even though the system said every night that it worked. So this is why backup validation is critical. Don't overlook it. It sounds really silly, but taking a couple minutes once a month, once every quarter, just to recover one file, one database, just to make sure you can open it, the records are intact, might save you some serious surprises and pain down the road, should that not be the case and there's something wrong with your routine. So it's just a question of testing your backups and validating that it is all working properly, and you'll rest a lot better knowing that they are performing and doing what they're supposed to be doing. Why do we need to do backups? Well, there's a whole slew of reasons. If we're talking, let's say, about the front end, well, it's easy while doing development. Sometimes things happen and you overwrite something you shouldn't have. You delete something you shouldn't have. Things like that. So being able to recover a previous version can really save your butt sometimes. The same thing, somebody can accidentally, and I've seen this in large corporations, accidentally delete a database, accidentally delete records. So having those recovery means in place can instantaneously, within a couple of minutes, get an entire organization back up and running. Obviously, beyond the accidental factor, there's also the simple fact that you can get corruption in databases. It happens. And sometimes, instead of fighting the corruption, trying to weed it out, clean it up, sometimes you just say, okay, well, we're going to lose a couple hours of work, but I can recover yesterday's and we're back in business. And sometimes that really is the way to go. And of course, hardware failure, it happens too. Hard drives crash, computers burn out, get fried, things like that. And being able to, pop out a hard drive, put in a new one, replace the system, the server, and just do a file recovery and get your database back in place will save you a lot of pain and get everyone back to work very quickly. So those are the main points. Obviously, there are other little nuances, but those are the big reasons. At the end of the day, it's just an extra security blanket to ensure that if anything ever goes wrong, you're in a position to recover from that and recover from it rapidly. It just saves you a lot of hassle. That's all. And that's basically the discussion on backing up your database. It can even extend, obviously, beyond Microsoft Access databases, because a lot of these techniques can be used to back up anything. And I've even used my backup routine for a database to actually also back up files and folders that are within the server. So I hope this helps a few of you get a little bit of a feel, an idea as to which approaches you can potentially explore, and perhaps give you a better understanding of which direction perhaps you want to take in your organization. If you don't do any backups, at least start doing a manual backup. But realistically, look towards some type of automated system. The Windows scheduled task works well as long as you're using a VB script that first checks for lock files, but it doesn't have the capacity to boot people out. And you're obviously going to want to do your backups at a point in time where you're more or less guaranteed that no one will be in the system. So in a lot of my cases, for my clients, I do it in the middle of the night if I'm going to use an automated system like that. Otherwise, using the database startup auto exec macro is truly a great way of approaching this scenario for an Access database always. I'm not talking about SQL Server backends and things like that. That's a whole other thing. And for that, once again, using an automated system that runs at a scheduled task, let's say in the middle of the night, really does work beautifully. I do that with some Azure databases currently. I use a flow to schedule a backup, and it works absolutely perfectly. I will leave it there for now. Thank you for spending, about 20 minutes of your day with me today, and I look forward to seeing you in the next video. If you don't mind, as always, like, share, subscribe, and if you can do anything to spread the word about my YouTube channel, it would be greatly appreciated. Take care, everyone, and have a nice end of day.